You must know that to all the three-brained beings of the earth, and also of course to the sculptors of that period, it was already known that in accordance always with the same great law of sevenfoldness, the dimensions of any definite part of any whole being ensue from the 7 dimensions of other of his secondary parts, which in their turn ensue from 7 tertiary parts, and so on and so forth. According to this, each large or small part of the whole totality of the planetary body of a being has exactly proportionately increasing or diminishing dimensions in relation to his other parts. For a clear understanding of what I've just said, the face of any three-brained being can serve as a good example. The facial dimensions of every three-centered being in general, and also the facial dimensions of the three-centered beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy, are the result of the dimensions of 7 different fundamental parts of the whole of his body. And the dimension of each separate part of the face is the result of 7 different dimensions of the whole face. For instance, the dimensions of the nose of any being are derived from the dimensions of the other parts of the face, and on this nose in its turn there are actualized 7 definite what are called surfaces. And these surfaces also have 7 lawful dimensions, down to the said atom itself of this face of theirs, which, as I have said, is one of the 7 independent dimensions composing the dimensions of the whole planetary body. In the deviations from these lawful dimensions, the learned sculptors, among the members of the adherents of legomenism, then in the city of Babylon, indicated all kinds of useful information and fragments of knowledge already known to them, which they intended to transmit to the beings of remote generations. On Saturdays, the day of mysteries, or the day of the theater, the demonstrations produced by learned members of this group were the most interesting, and, as it is said, the most popular. I personally preferred these Saturdays to all the other days of the week and tried not to miss one of them. And I preferred them because the demonstrations arranged on those days by the learned beings of that group frequently provoked such spontaneous and sincere laughter among all the other terrestrial three-centered beings who were in the given section of the club, that I sometimes forgot among which three-centered beings I was. And that being impulse manifested itself in me, which is proper to arise only in one-natured beings, like myself. At the outset, the learned beings of that group demonstrated before the other beings of the club various forms of being experiencings and being manifestations. Then later, they collectively selected, from all that was demonstrated, what corresponded to the various details of one or another already existing mystery, or of one newly created by themselves. And only after this did they indicate in those being experiencings and manifestations, reproduced by them, what they wished, by means of intentionally allowed deviations from the principles of the law of sevenfoldness. Here it is necessary to notice that although in former epochs mysteries occasionally containing many instructive notions chanced to reach some of their generations mechanically, and sometimes passed from generation to generation to beings of very remote generations, yet those mysteries in the contents of which the learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legomenism then intentionally placed varied knowledge, calculating that it would reach beings of very remote generations, have during recent times almost totally ceased to exist. These mysteries there incorporated in the process of their ordinary existence centuries earlier, already began gradually to disappear soon after the Babylonian period. At first, their place was taken by what are called their kezbaji, or as they are now called there on the continent Europe, puppet shows, Petrushka. But afterwards, they were finally ousted by their still existing theatrical shows or spectacles, which are there now one of the forms of that said contemporary art of theirs which acts particularly perniciously in the process of the progressive shrinking of their psyche. These theatrical spectacles replaced the mysteries after the beings at the beginning of the contemporary civilization, to whom only a fifth to a tenth was passed down of the information about how and what these said Babylonian learned mysterists had done, began to think of imitating them in this also, and set about doing, as it were, the same. From that time on, the other beings there called these imitators of the mysteries players, comedians, actors, and at the present time, they already call them artists, of whom I may say very many have sprung up during recent times. And these learned beings of that time, belonging to the group of the mysterists, indicated various useful information, and the knowledge already attained by them, by means of what are called currents of associative movements of the participants in these mysteries. Although the three-brained beings of your planet then already well knew about the laws of the currents of associative movements, yet absolutely no information whatsoever concerning these laws has passed to the contemporary three-brained beings. As this said currents of associative movements does not proceed in the presences of the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, as it generally proceeds in the presences of other three-brained beings, and as there were quite special reasons there for this, proper to them alone, I must therefore first of all explain to you in rather more detail. The process is the same as that which also proceeds in us, but it proceeds in us when we are intentionally resting to allow the whole functioning of our common presence freely to transform, without hindrance by our will, all the varieties of being energy required by our all-around active existence. Whereas in them, these said various being energies can now arise only during their total inactivity, that is, during what they call their sleep, and then of course only after a fashion. Owing to the fact that they, like every other three-brained being of the whole of our great universe, have three separate independent spiritualized parts, each of which has as a central place for the concentration of all its functioning a localization of its own, which they themselves call a brain. All the impressions in their common presences, whether coming from without or arising from within, are also perceived independently by each of these brains of theirs, in accordance with the nature of these impressions. And afterwards, as it is also proper to proceed in the presences of every kind of being without distinction of brain system, these impressions, together with previous impressions, compose the total, and thanks to occasional shocks, evoke in each of these separate brains an independent association. So, my boy, from the time when these favorites of yours completely ceased consciously to actualize in their common presences the being particular duty, thanks only to the results of which what is called sane comparative